Good evening, my name is Adrian Kelly. I'm the artistic director of the festival, and this is my colleague Jacopo Spirei, with whom I've worked many times. He's a wonderful stage director and has directed this new production of Rossini's La Donna del Lago for Buxton. And in this performance talk, I just want to look a little bit at the opera itself, the music, the tradition that it comes from, the traditions that it perhaps informed. Look into the music, talk a little about the performers and Jacopo's ideas. And then there'll be time for questions as well. Not a very long time because we have a performance to attend to. We've been doing some last minute rejigging of little things, which has to happen. The show must go on very soon, but there are things that must be done. But it's been a very exciting journey for me to discover this piece in more depth. We all think of Rossini as a great comedian, a bon viveur, a fellow who gave up composing to become a chef and enjoy the life of Paris. And the things we know best of his are Barbara of Seville, which was written very early, like so many of his great successes, 3 years, I think, or so before La Donna del Lago. And so the tendency is to think of him as someone who puts on jolly fare, which passes quickly and is light and fast and has a big crescendo in. And those things are all true, but his serious opera output is also quite remarkable. And the more you look into it, the more you realize he was a seriously influential composer, not just for Italian composers, but for composers around Europe. And La Donna del Lago was written in 1819 for the Teatro San Carlo in Naples. And I think it's good to start there. Jacopo, one of the things you did in 2019 was a bicentenary performance of Hermione by Rossini. What's Teatro San Carlo like? I mean, some of you would have been, I'm sure, but still.
Hello, first of all, good evening. Sorry. It's a very particular place, of course. You know, it's the only opera house that's never closed since its opening in the 18th century. Not during the war, and it never stopped being a theatre ever. So there is a continuous tradition in that sense. And you know, Rossini has been artistic director of that theatre, not only composing operas for it, but creating seasons for it. Same way as Donizetti, who took over from Rossini and all that. So you are in a place where you have the privilege to stage operas that were meant for that space, that city and that feeling. Curiously enough, the one thing with the San Carlo, it's monumental, it's a huge theatre, if you've never seen it, it's a very beautiful theatre. But it has a great intimacy about it, even though it's massive and the orchestra pit is huge. And the numbers they used at the time were immense. You know, the chorus of an average Naples opera was about 150 people. That was the standard. 120. The chorus, it was, you know, you name it. It was king, so they could throw money at it. It wasn't a problem of economy. But the extraordinary thing is the intimacy that stage can evoke, which in a way is what I found here in this jewel of the theatre itself, which is gorgeous. It's the possibility of doing grand-scale opera and at the same time very intimate, strong human relationship-driven opera, which most of these opera series are. So Naples has got this quality about itself that the acoustic is extraordinary, and you always feel like singers are singing next to you. Luckily here we have the same feeling, different sizes, admittedly, but that's, I'd say that's the most interesting aspect of it, besides being in a crazy city that lives next to a volcano that could explode any day. Therefore, the future doesn't really matter, everybody lives in the present. That's why Naples is like that. It's a lot of fun, go if you can, but don't leave there.
And just looking at the material of Donna del Lago, it's in some ways a crazy idea to put it into a small theatre like this, because it's not just got a double chorus and triple chorus and numbers for just the women and just the men. It's also got a stage band, which would have been, as Jacopo said, a huge number of not very good musicians if you read the reviews from some of the early performances. And so putting it in here, It's a title, though, which we felt matched the Buxton ethos, which is it's a great, important title, which doesn't get played a lot, but which deserves an airing. And we have found, I think, the intimacy in the piece. And another thing that's very key to mention is that often when these big barnstorming pieces are done, which are full of vocal fireworks and showpiece arias, people just throw everything at that and then ignore the story. And what they do is they cut all the recitatives. Now, in this piece, the recitatives are still being... The tradition through Mozart, who was a huge hero for Rossini, and all of the other opera seria tradition, up to that point, the serious opera tradition until the beginning of the 19th century, was to have them accompanied either by a harpsichord and cello or a forte piano and cello. And now we're at the time where people are starting to think in a more through, composed way. That's one of the ways in which this piece is very influential. It begins without a barnstorming overture. It just begins with atmosphere, which looks ahead to the likes of Verdi and even Wagner. I hate it when people mention Wagner, but it's true.
But Wagner loved Rossini's music. There's a famous meeting that they had in Paris. So
no, indeed, and I think it's also what I think is interesting is that by leaving in these recitatives, which are written for the full orchestra, we have some subsidiary parts, Serrano and Albina, whose essential function is to talk us through what's happening in this complicated landscape. And that was a very important choice, and the way that I've always worked with Jacopo on a number of productions that we've done together is really to spend a lot of time at the piano with the singers, working out exactly which story we're trying to tell and in what way. And I don't know if you have anything else to say about that.
What's interesting in Rossini's serious operas is there are like Greek tragedies. The structure of it and the way the opera speaks breathe in big strokes. So you have the feelings that are sculpted in time and elongated for a very long time and re-expressed and reinvented every time. The recits have that function to prepare the situation. You know, composers were very interested in situations. It's with Puccini and later composers where actually the drama, the realisticness of it becomes important. But, you know, the classic example is Verdi's Trovatore. It's a plot that makes no sense from beginning till end, but the situations are phenomenally interesting, and Verdi writes loads of letters about it. And what all these composers were interested in, they were interested in the conflicts. And here you have a woman who's in love with a man, promised to a second man, but tempted by a third man, for example. No, it's very 18, 19, not too bad.
And I think it's important to talk about that because obviously this piece was growing from the opera seria tradition, and in fact the singer of the role of Malcolm, Benedetta Pisaroni was her name. She was taught by a castrato, so very much coming straight out of the older tradition of the opera seria. The arias themselves are written in a fairly simplistic way, but with the intention of having a great deal of ornamentation, and for that we have a wonderful singer, Catherine Carby, the Australian mezzo, who's really, I would suggest a specialist for this repertoire, and it really brings something wonderful to that role. Then we have Elena, who is a force of nature, I think it's fair to say.
It's a surprisingly modern character. Of course, we always say that when we talk about operas, because that's why the art form is so relevant and so powerful, is that it speaks to people every day, in every time and age. And here again, like often in opera, we have another example of a woman who fights her ground against a male-dominated world. And as you can see, opera always has strong women. It's very rare that you have silly, light, superficial women. I can't think of anyone at the moment. Not even Zerbinetta is superficial. So that's what's curious in that sense, and what's powerful. So it's a woman who fights for her freedom and for her way, and to decide, to find a way to determine her life and her choices in the background of a civil war of political reasons. Father wanting to marry her to a political leader so you can create a unity against the king, James of Scotland. It's a civil war, as you know, the plot. And it's like the story of Aida. It's very similar in that sense. She's in love with the wrong man. The complexity of this opera is that her feelings are very three-dimensional. She is actually tempted by a grown-up man who comes to her and shows her understanding and a way of talking to her that it's equal to equal. He doesn't put himself at her feet like a lover, like Malcolm does, and it's not an arrogant, abusive father like Douglas, or a husband who's buying a woman like Rodrigo. In that, the dynamic is incredibly interesting, and it's very well developed through the piece.
And for that role, the Lady of the Lake herself, Elena, we have Moira Flavin, who was a mezzo and is now a soprano, which it's written in that way that sort of is between the two voice types, and is an utterly three-dimensional actress, and is quite an extraordinary performer, I found, and I hope you enjoy that. And the central figure, in a sense, with her is Uberto, later Giacomo James, the King James, and that's played by the Maltese tenor Nico Darmanin. And this is an interesting role because in the Rossini tradition, it has a lot of coloratura. But when I first asked Jacopo what kind of singer he wanted, he said it needs to be somebody who's lived life. It needs to be somebody grown up. There's this thing which Jacopo referred to about a grown-up relationship that Elena sees a possibility of with a man who sees her as an equal. And Nico is he's a man with many layers. He's an extraordinary virtuosic performer, but he's also very real in his work on stage. I think that's fair to say. Yeah.
He's got his own brand of gin.
If you meet him on the street, you won't be able to stop him talking about it. But he's an extraordinary man, and you'll feel that he has an energetic quality, which is quite surprising. And then the other extreme role. So there is, as always, I think Otello was here at the festival some years ago, which has 4 tenors. And by the way, is quoted in Viva la Diva, if you're going to see that in a few days' time, which you must. Which Viva la Diva, I should say, is taking the mickey out of opera seria, and I think top of the list was probably La Donna del Lago. There is a reason why they're both programmed. Anyway,
thank you.
The reason for the amazing thing about Rodrigo, the part of Rodrigo, it's something of a cameo, but he comes in with this extraordinary aria in which he sings from a high C, and if he's feeling lucky, high D, down to a low A flat. If anybody has ever sung will understand that that's lower than quite a lot of baritones can sing, and certainly higher than most tenors can sing. So it's extraordinarily extreme and requires a very special voice. And for that we have the American tenor John Irvin, who also was in Hermione in Rossini, in Naples. And finally, and then we have the clan chieftain, Eleanor's father, Douglas, or Douglas, if you're in Rossini land, and that's played by the young British-based baritone David Ireland, who thus far has tended to sing comic buffo repertoire, but I am very glad that he's taken a step into something else, because he's a great actor. He's somebody who can sing the coloratura with power and authority, and he makes up the big 5. I would like to mention 2 other great singing actors. Fiona Finsbury, who's an important figure as Albina. I'm not sure if that's something you want to explain or leave to explain itself. And then Serrano, who is the young Welsh tenor Robert Lewis. But Fiona's character is...
Yeah, I can say that we've used... The opera features only 2 women, and the rest is men. And the third woman is an travesti role, so it's a woman who plays a man. So what we've done is to create a relationship between these 2 women, in that sense, and a relationship with modern women and past women, as one great journey of evolution to the woman's condition in society.
I think just a few more words about the music before I ask if there are any questions. It's an extraordinary piece because, as we've said before, it's not one of the central. Well, it is a key work. It's a work everyone knows about, and
it was Rossini's first big success as opera seria. It was the one that sort of made him. He was already super famous in Naples, but it's the one that gave him international career in that sense.
Indeed, and I think when he was young, he was known in is he in Venice? He was known as the Little Mozart because he borrowed so much. And in any of the other comedies, or the other operas that are more central, you hear that the homage to Mozart. and I would say that with some obvious examples of that would be the beautiful duet in the first act. These I'm sort of suggesting some highlights to watch out for, although there are many highlights. The act 1 duet between Malcolm and Elena, which is a short number in A major, which was a favourite key of Mozart's, and very for love duets. And in itself, that's a sort of a homage, I would say. And it's a moment where you just breathe and see some human emotion in amongst some fairly, how should I say, it's not coarse music, but it's tough, it's rough somehow.
It's violent.
It's violent, that's the word. And there is a sense in which, in the second act, the drive and the bellicose attitudes of all these different clans, it sort of goes more into a slightly mysterious realm in the second act, where we're finding the inside life. And I think that's another number which I have to mention, which is the trio in the second act, which we worked on in the...
That's not short.
No, that's not short. That's the opposite of short. That's as long as many a Mozart finale, if you know your big Mozart Da Ponte operas. I think the last act finale of Marriage of Figaro feels pretty long, and it's about 16 minutes. The trio we timed at 19 in the rehearsal room. I think it might be 20, and it has a sort of a duel of the tenors. It starts as a duet, turns into a trio, and then of course the chorus join as well, and it just ramps up to the most extraordinary conclusion. And you have the feeling he's trying to prove his capacity, the extent of his ability to create.
It's completely virtuoso, it's extraordinary in that sense. And dramaturgical at the same time. That's what's interesting of this piece. That the repetitions is never banal, and it's never just for the sake of aesthetic, but has a real structural element. And that's why we didn't cut all the repetitions, for example, as you often hear it. And you'll notice that it feels, even though longer, it feels a lot more compact.
Yes, I think that's important, that when you can follow the story of one of these operas, I mean, following the story of any opera is a challenge often. And when you can follow the story and you can follow the relationships, it gives it a symmetry and often a simplicity, and it's very much more relatable. And those are things that we've gone for. It's not an easy piece by any means, but it's thrilling, and I certainly hope you enjoy it. At this point, I think I'd ask if anybody would like to ask any questions about either to Jacopo, to myself, or about any aspect of the festival or this production. Yes, please.
Do you want to say anything about the set or the period in which it's you placed it?
I think that Jacopo should mention something. The set designer that I should have mentioned is Madeleine Boyd, and she's done a wonderful job. This, as you know, well, I think I'll let you talk about the set and the setting. Yeah.
Yes. You're about to see it. It's a little bit like telling you what's in a present for Christmas. As I give you the package, and say, oh, inside there's a little car. Hope you like it. And it sort of spoils a little bit the effect of that. So I'm not going to describe it in specifics. As I was telling earlier, we've treated it as a dialogue between past and present. And it reflects in the opera that element. There's also an element of uncovering the past as we do come into this kind of performances. So I wanted to transpose that also on stage, and you'll see how I've done it, and then you'll be the judge of it in that sense. Also, if you need to explain a show as a director, you sort of failed at your job, I'm afraid. If you have to do 3 pages of director notes and you need the instructions to understand the show, we have a problem. It's not theatre, it becomes an intellectual exercise. So there are elements of modernity and elements of the past, mixed, hopefully in a good way that helps the story. I can tell you that, when I start working on a piece, I start from the text and from the music. I start from the score, and I work from that onto the stage. So everything you'll see, I don't feel it's imposed to the piece in that sense, but it's what the piece dictated me. Of course, then it's a land of taste, like or not, obviously. But that's how I've approached the work in that regard. As I love opera, I love the art form itself. I don't think opera needs help. What only needs is to do it, to tell the story that is intended by the composer, and if possible, take as many filters as you can from all the layers that history and tradition has put on top. Bohème is a classic example. We always think it's a love story, but in fact it's a story of two people not really loving each other, but desperately sticking to each other in spite of the fact that they cannot stick together. If you read the book, it's very clear in that sense. But the opera is full of, the opera world is full of these stories. So in a way, we've tried to take off a little bit of the folklore. We kept it, some of the folklore, because again, it's an Italian composer setting it in Scotland, having never been in Scotland. So it's an idea of Scotland. It's not actually about Scotland, but it's about Italian sensitivity and Italian approach. It's a very Catholic piece, for example, which is the least Scottish thing you can think of. It's what happens with Verdi's Otello. No, there's a big, Iago has its own big credo, which is a big Catholic thing. It's got nothing to do with Shakespeare, and so on. No, it's famously, Elisabetta di Liverpool, I think it's Donizetti set on the hills surrounding Liverpool. Exactly, my point. Puccini never been to Japan, only talked to the wife of the ambassador of Japan in Florence about what Japan is. Turandot is set in the China of fairy tales. Falstaff is set in UK because Verdi could not complain about his fellow citizens of Busseto, but that is completely an Italian provincial city of gossip. So in that sense, I didn't try to do big kills and all that, but I've tried to do elements of historical Scotland that was very connected to Roman times in a way. You know, big clash at the beginning of the turbulent history of this island starts with the Romans' invasion, you know, and then carries on with the Vikings and so on. But that's how far back we went, if anything, to just try to evoke this element of folklore. It's all suggested, of course. I'm never trying to be super realistic because it's not in the spirit of 19th century theatre. It was all very imaginative. If you think about any Renaissance paintings, for example, of religious painting, all the people surrounding Jesus Christ or the Virgin Mary tend to be in modern clothes. There are contemporary clothes. Usually the people that commission the painting are portrayed in those paintings and all that. Last weekend I went over to the National Gallery again because it's one of my favorite places in the whole world. Their section of Renaissance is absolutely extraordinary. And you see that constantly. So in a way, naturalism and creating a world that is similar to us is very much Puccini, Leoncavallo, Mascagni. It's a much later world, before everything was a lot more connected to fantasy and imagination in that regard. Sorry for the long answer.
Good. One more question before we have to stop.
We can do it real quick.
Yeah, how faithful to the original poem is the opera?
No, very little, in fact. Yeah.
Can you just repeat the question? So how faithful, just in case people don't know, how faithful is the opera to the original poem?
Not much. I went through the trouble of reading the whole thing, which for an Italian it's not easy language. That took a long time. It's loosely based on. It was a hit, of course, written 9 years before. It was a big novel, very famous, and sort of started the Romantic movement. But of course it's translated in completely Italian matters, with the Italianization of a lot of things. So you have the flair of it, and somehow the structure of it, but I would say it's quite far from the poem, actually.
And one more question.
Okay, you said you did it in San Carlo. Are there things which you see here doing it a second time which you didn't bring out then?
No, I did the opera that Rossini composed before Hermione. So I've done, there's 3 famous operas, Elisabetta, Regina d'Inghilterra, Hermione, and Donna del Lago is the third sort
so you
of...
haven't done this one?
No, but I've done the other 2 before. What's interesting about Elisabetta, Regina d'Inghilterra and Ascoppi, he wrote it before Barbara of Sevilla, and the overture is the Barbara of Sevilla overture. He took it from an opera seria into a comedy. And also Rosina's entrance is the aria that Elisabetta sings as she comes on, with different text and a slightly different tempo. But just to say how much our ear can fool us, because some of it will sound quite jolly, but it's intended in a complete different aesthetic. So it requires us to do a little bit of a jump, because sometimes you feel dillo, 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 it's always jolly music, and in fact it means threaten or pain, or it's a bit like Baroque operas does sometimes.
Absolutely. And anything else? Yes, one more question, yes?
Have you had to alter the orchestration very much?
And that's a question for me. Have we had to alter the orchestration? No. We have, the largest it gets is 2 extra horns joined for Douglas's aria. Other than that, it's a relatively normal-sized orchestra in the pit. On the stage, you have this stage band, and I don't even want to think about what that would have been in a huge theatre, how it would have sounded. And our solution here, also given the fact that we simply don't have the room in the backstage area to do offstage music or onstage music. I mean, we've got a chorus of 26, which is already small, but they make enough sound. But on this stage, and given also there are various technical things, you can't fill the back left or the back right of the stage because of the sight lines. So you'll notice that you've seen lots of V-shaped stage designs in any opera you've seen here. And when you haven't, you've been wondering where someone's got to. And the thing about that is that it means we haven't got much space. So what we did is we reorchestrated. There are reorchestrations of these band versions. Nothing was written down. Nothing is sacred with those. They were very much depending on who turned up on the day, kind of thing. So that has been adjusted for our particular requirements, and we have musicians, young musicians from the Royal Northern College of Music who are joining us. Just as I should mention that the other people involved, we have our own chorus, we have the Northern Chamber Orchestra in the pit, and joining the chorus, the extra chorus, so to speak, are young singers from the Royal Northern College of Music with whom we have a continuing collaboration. So no changes to the orchestration. That's actually very important to me. I just say this, whenever we're looking for titles for this festival, I have to look and see what fits in the pit. I can only fit 6 violins, first violins in the pit, and I'd love to do something by, you mentioned Leoncavallo a second ago, or Mascagni. There are wonderful rarities by these composers. Unfortunately, they don't fit. And I have this, people will say, why don't you do X? And I just want to, I smile, I want to bury my head in my hands, because I would love to. At the same time, there are enough wonderful pieces, and what I am proud of with this particular piece is that it doesn't really make sense to do it here. But then when you watch the production, it does make sense. So we've managed to make it work, and that is a big part of our ethos. And I take this opportunity also to thank Jacopo, with whom I've worked many times and who I will always want to work with more. So thank you, Jacopo, thank you all for coming, and I really do hope you enjoy it. It's a remarkable piece, and I think it deserves to be heard more often, and I think we found good singers, and I shouldn't sound so confident before a premiere, but I'm genuinely excited to find out what you think about it. So enjoy the rest of the evening, and see you soon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.